Chapter 1. The Healing Journey, Awakening to the Sacred. As an only child, I grew up in the company of adults, with no one my own age to play with. But I was never bored, because like many children, I had a friend no one else could see. Adults sometimes call these friends imaginary, but most children will tell you their friend is very real, and I was no exception. I can see him clearly to this day, a tall, glowing being who lived in a corner of my room. My friend visited me frequently, playing with me and also imparting much wisdom to me. Most significant was the vision he shared with me, in which I healed people through the laying on of hands. With the scene playing in my mind like a motion picture, he said, "Hold tight to this vision, Carlos, for this is your destiny." So I determined early in life that I was put on earth to serve humanity. With a child's ingenuousness, I decided I would not be happy until the entire world was also happy. With time, of course, I realized the world was filled with much suffering and hardship, but I swore I would do my best to positively touch the lives of those around me. When I read about and witnessed the miraculous work of the medical profession, I believed I had found my calling. I would become a healer. Yet I knew that the language of healing encompassed more than just the terminology and practice of medical technology. A sense of purpose, fulfillment, and wholeness is found only through an awareness of the sacred. This awareness often stands dormant and forgotten. I sought a new language, an integration of spirituality, healing, and theology. I was looking for a language that could reawaken our sense of the sacred and connect us with a deep, timeless energy. My search began in high school in my native country, Chile. My favorite subjects were history and biology. History interested me because I had visions of the past, which I later realized were past lives. Biology intrigued me because of my fascination with life and its processes. Despite my love of learning, I sensed a deep chasm between so-called book learning and life's experiences. My country was in the midst of great social and political turmoil at this time. Turmoil I could see on a personal level in the faces of my countrymen. What we learned in school was theoretical, and I felt as though we were being indoctrinated with no regard or application to the upheaval and suffering in the streets. Despite my young years, questions about our purpose on this planet gnawed at me. I wrestled with philosophical explanations of life, death, and suffering, and sought answers in the form of mystical explanations or experiences from my teachers. I found inspiration in the writing of the Middle Ages, most notably in the ideas of St. Francis of Assisi. Despite his privileged upbringing, St. Francis became a messenger of spiritual and social concern to all the world's people, rich and poor alike. I was convinced my native country was worth saving, worth trying to bring to life in my own space and time. The timeless directive inscribed on the Oracle of Delphi, "Know thyself," implored me to continue looking for answers. I began medical school in the 60s. Change was in the air. The Chilean government was now controlled by the Christian Democratic Party, which had undertaken a large-scale land reform program. This was also a time when many scientific theories were being tested and questioned. The prevailing idea of the cosmos as an eternal machine running out of steam, heading towards a thermodynamic death, began to be superseded by evolutionary cosmology. Matter, once thought of as a mere thing, was now seen as more of a process. Energy and fields were considered the ultimate principles, more fundamental than matter. I sensed that science was slowly converging from many different disciplines toward a new view, one with unique and profound implications. And of course, I had an inkling that this new view was spiritual in nature. This notion was fueled by the fact that spiritual awareness groups were springing up all over Chile. During the selection process for medical school in Chile, prospective students were interviewed to find out, among other things, their motives for becoming a doctor. When the question was posed to me, I told the examiner, I would like to dedicate my life to serving all those in need. It sounds like you ought to become a priest then, the examiner replied. While sitting in my first biology class in medical school, a few months later, the professor was discussing the process of evolution from bacteria to plants to animals with an ever-increasing complexity. So where is it all leading? I asked the professor. What is the purpose of life? Perhaps you ought to be studying philosophy, he replied, intending to get a laugh out of my fellow students at my expense. My professor's attempt at a joke did not fall on deaf ears. I took his suggestion seriously and studied philosophy along with my required medical courses. I felt they would broaden my reach as a healer. I devoured the teachings of Martin Heidegger and other existential philosophers. Their concept of the here and now confirmed what I had thought all along. Human beings are larger than their physical, biological existence. It was an examination of our relationship with animals. All religious traditions are grounded in an awareness of the sacred qualities of plants and animals. Christianity, for instance, associates the dove with the Holy Spirit and evokes images of the eagle carrying the Bible. Somewhere along the way, Western culture's recognition of this sacred relationship with animals fell by the wayside. Animals were used in school to help us understand biological and physiological processes. Most often the animals were dead. While the technical term in science for killing an animal is sacrifice, I don't feel that any sort of sacred ritual was performed. The animals were not treated with the compassion that should have been accorded living beings. In my eyes, a scientist was a kind of priest, and the laboratory was a temple. The treatment of the animals left me somewhat bitter. In one class, for instance, 12 rats were sacrificed. Their livers were extracted, homogenized, blended, and centrifuged. The procedure was cold, unfeeling, and mechanical. During my time in medical school, I came to realize my calling to heal the whole person, the body, mind, and spirit, would not be as easily fulfilled as I had expected. It would not be accomplished simply by becoming a doctor. Priests handled the spirit. Philosophers dealt with the mind. The medical profession I was coming to know specialized in the body. We were taught how to treat physical symptoms with technological cures. Any treatment or even speculation outside the physical technological realm was a mark of unprofessional behavior. This was not mere speculation on my part either. We were literally taught to ignore the emotional and spiritual well-being of the patient. In medical school, my surgery class was introduced to a 27-year-old man with testicular cancer. His 23-year-old wife and his baby were there in the room visiting as our professor explained the man's scheduled surgery. Later, outside the classroom, our professor explained to us that the man was sure to die in a matter of weeks, but the surgical procedure was standard in such cases. I thought it was crazy to put the man and his family through the trauma of surgery when it would not substantially increase his comfort or his chances for survival. Wouldn't it be better to spend our time and resources helping this young man and his wife come to terms with his death? I asked the surgery professor. The professor turned to me, and a silence came over my fellow classmates as he intoned, "You will never be a good surgeon if you start worrying about the patient's emotional state." Yet it became clearer to me, as I observed patients and how they were treated in the name of healing, that the connection between the physical, spiritual, and mental spheres of life was substantial and not to be ignored. I saw patients recover more quickly or more fully when doctors simply explained how treatments worked. Giving patients the power to select from a variety of treatment options seemed to help as much as the treatments themselves. And though many of my fellow students scoffed or made jokes when passing rooms where the patient's bed was surrounded by friends and family members all bowing their heads in prayer, some of the more remarkable recoveries coincidentally happened in those rooms. The combined energy of people in prayer, I saw, was a great resource and complement to medical procedures and bore no cost or harmful side effects. Physicians, accustomed only to working with hard, measurable data and enslaved by scientific cause and effect, were uncertain how to interpret findings that suggested, for instance, that a wife's love and support could reduce her husband's risk of developing heart disease. Most also dismissed cancer cures that appeared to have been passed down on faith. There was a retired dean and professor of the medical school who visited my ward at the hospital for 3 of my years there. He caused a stir among some of my fellow students because he lied to his patients. He told a woman with cancer that everyone felt her recovery was very important and they were all praying for her. The doctor himself was an avowed atheist. He told a man with liver failure that he was going to be fine and would feel better soon. In too many of those cases, I saw patients outlive their clinical prognosis because of the hope inspired by this man's white lies. In my final year of medical school, I was living in Santiago, Chile, with a young woman named Isabella. She was beautiful, with long dark hair that moved with a life of its own when she turned her head, and often fell in front of her beautiful blue eyes. She was tall, and her slim, lithe figure was evidence of the many hours she spent at sports and dance. She was also conventional and somewhat shy, and I began to realize that we didn't have much in common. She was an administrative secretary, and her life seemed to revolve around getting a high-paying job, making lots of money, and accumulating expensive material possessions. I believe she appreciated me more for the potential income I could make as a doctor than for who I really was. Isabella didn't seem to understand what I meant when I talked of spiritual matters. When I told her I had seen a patient die and wondered what happened to his soul, she told me I shouldn't worry about it. On more than one occasion we discussed breaking up, but we always patched up our disagreements and continued on together. I feared living with Isabella would inevitably lead me to a dull, shallow life, based on materialism and what the two of us could acquire, rather than what we could contribute to our relationship or to others. In spite of my fears, I had taken no action to avoid that sort of life. I persisted down the easy route of keeping the status quo. One day I drove down Avenida Providencia, one of the main thoroughfares in Santiago, with no particular destination in mind. I had been swimming with Isabella, and after dropping her off at our apartment, took off to be by myself. Stopped at a red light, I glanced at the blue Fiat next to my car. The beautiful young blonde woman driving the car glanced over at me. It was a chance moment that would change the course of my life. When I looked into her sparkling green eyes, I was immediately and irresistibly attracted to her. My heart, now pounding in my chest, felt as though it were opening and expanding. It was a strange and overwhelming sensation I had never really felt before. In an instant, I wanted to follow this woman anywhere and do anything that she asked. I leaned over to open the window, desperate to talk to her, but she looked away. When I finally rolled the window down, I noticed the light had changed and realized she was driving away. I tried to follow her, but she immediately pulled over and parked her car. While I was strongly attracted to her beauty, there was also a curiosity and familiarity I had never felt for anyone before. Since she hadn't held my gaze, though, I decided she probably wasn't interested in me. That assumption, along with my obligation to Isabella, made me drive past and go on toward home. I attempted to clear my mind of this confusing whirl of thoughts about the woman, but after driving only a few blocks, I circled back to where I saw her park. Though I had managed to eliminate many scattered thoughts and ideas from my mind, one would not go away. I still held the vision of this blonde woman as clearly as a single candle in a darkened room. I tried to reason with myself. I thought, if I drive down that block again, and neither she nor the car is there, I will forget about the whole incident. As I turned the corner onto the street where the woman had parked, I saw her leaving a nearby building and approaching the car. She was a rather petite woman, but she carried herself with elegance in her stunning dress, which I could tell was expensive. I slowed and stopped beside her as she opened her purse to look for her keys. I quickly rolled down the window and searched for a pen and some paper on the seat beside me. I realize this must seem very strange, I said. You're not only the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, but I also feel somehow that we were destined to meet. She smiled at the compliment and then peered into my car to get a better look at me. What do you want from me? She asked. I don't want you to think I'm accustomed to meeting women this way, I said. She shot me a look of disdain. Don't bother, she said, turning to open her car door. I'm married. A car behind mine was honking for me to stop blocking traffic. I don't care, I pleaded. I need to know who you are. I beg you, please let me have your phone number and I will try to explain later. Reluctantly, she told me her number and quickly got into her car. I drove off toward home and saw in my rearview mirror that she had turned around and headed in the opposite direction. At the next stoplight, I stared at the slip of paper on the seat beside me, checking to make sure I could read the phone number my trembling hand had written. In the excitement of the moment, I realized I hadn't even asked for her name. I prayed the number she gave me was really hers. As I have since recognized, strong emotions such as those I felt for this woman cannot easily be dismissed. These chance meetings always seem to have a purpose. Many times I have left my house feeling as if I needed to call a certain friend. Over the course of the day, I will run into another person with the same name as the person I meant to call, or someone who is about to go to visit that person. A scrap of paper with that person's phone number on it will pop out of my jacket pocket 2 or 3 times. If I continue to ignore the synchronicities trying to get me to call this friend of mine, and especially if the call is extremely important to one or both of us, the synchronicities will start to get even more obvious. Perhaps my friend will accidentally call a wrong number that happens to be an office where I'm having a meeting. Though I did not know at the time my meeting with this woman happened for an important purpose, it was the result of a deep connection between the two of us and would lead me to a path that I still follow today. Confusing, contradictory feelings of guilt at deceiving my girlfriend and electrifying passion for this woman assaulted my senses. Perspiration beaded on my forehead, and the rhythm of my breathing grew short and purposeful. Logic told me I was driving the car, yet I couldn't feel the steering wheel and had to force myself to concentrate on the flow of traffic. The sound of the young woman's voice echoed over and over in my mind, drowning out the sounds of car engines and horns. I drove around town until I was sure my girlfriend had left our apartment. The minutes seemed excruciatingly long. About an hour later, I was at home and on the phone with the young blonde woman. Her name was Françoise. I told her about my upcoming internship and about Isabella. She told me about her marital problems and that she had come to Santiago from Europe for a vacation. She had a young child who was staying with relatives while she was away. We talked of politics, philosophy, and religion. We discussed our childhoods. We talked about our dreams. While conversing with her, I was most certainly in an unordinary state of mind. I started having visions of another place and time. I saw myself in a Paris salon in the early 19th century. The salon was part of an 18th century chateau and had marble floors and red burgundy walls. I could see the patterns in the material in my garments and could feel the weight of the many layers of clothing I wore. A wig was on my head, and I could actually smell the heavy makeup on my face. I could feel the coldness of the marble tabletop. There was the tea that smelled of Salon and sweetbread that tasted like Christmas cake. I could hear the music of Mozart being played by an orchestra, and Françoise was there with me. I had experienced feelings and visions of past lives before. As a young child, I often sat in my room, dreaming my way through worlds I later identified as pieces of past lives. The first time my mother entered my room and saw me sitting in my chair in a very unusual posture, with my extended fingers touching my knees, she went to a shelf of books in the next room and pulled a large volume off one of the top shelves. She came back in and told me she had a picture to show me. As she leafed through the book, I saw pictures of deserts and pyramids. Finally, she came upon a photograph of a temple entrance in Egypt, and she turned the book to show me. My posture was just like that of the giant statues at Abu Simbel in southwest Egypt. I sensed I had been a king in this land at the time the temple had been built, but somehow I had never seen the completion of the temple because I had fled into exile. I started to wonder what part of me could possibly remain the same from an Egyptian king to a French courtier to a child in Chile. Talking to Françoise, I conveyed my impression that we had met in a past life. She said she was also sensing we had met before. We talked on, laughing, sighing in recognition. We started feeling so strongly that we belonged together that we questioned the plans we had made for our lives up to that point. We arranged to meet the following day, and over the next week, we spent more and more time together. Our bond strengthened as we became lovers. Feelings long since buried came rushing to the surface, including one of my earliest memories, my first birthday celebration. I was sitting on a yellow wooden high chair at a table surrounded by my parents, aunts, and uncles. Doesn't he have his daddy's eyes? And his smile looks like yours. And other comments about my little body circulated the table. The table was set with Bavarian plates and teacups that had very colorful designs on them. Plates filled with a variety of colorful foods, cheeses, breads, and a large variety of fruit lay neatly on a white tablecloth, embroidered with what I later learned was my father's coat of arms. To my right, near the end of the table, a pair of deep blue penetrating eyes looked at me. They were my grandfather's eyes. Something about Grandpa's gaze awakened me to the realization that I am not this body. I was locked in that moment of time, staring at my grandfather. I realized the discomfort I felt at the comments about my body was caused by my knowledge that there was something more essential and unique beneath my physical appearance. At that point, the birthday party took on a wholly different perspective. We were celebrating the anniversary of my transformation from pure spirit to matter. Looking back, I consider Grandpa the first of many teachers to come into my life. Now Françoise reminded me of that early lesson. When she looked into my eyes, I sensed she saw beyond my body's physical features, into my soul. Her penetrating gaze connected to my very essence, causing my breath to catch in my throat. No one since Grandpa had touched me so deeply. My heart blossomed, nourished daily by my love for Françoise and the positive perspective she provided me on each waking moment. Parks and restaurants and other places I had been to hundreds of times suddenly seemed completely different. They became luminous and welcoming and safe. I felt a joy as I had never felt it before. Often while sitting in a cafe with Françoise, talking about something totally inconsequential, the weather, a threatened transportation strike, the arrival at the hospital of a long-awaited carton of cotton swabs, I would suddenly feel an unrelated tremendous sense of joy. This joie de vivre was so powerful, I wanted to project it into eternity. I couldn't specifically pinpoint anything causing my sudden joy. The sun was strong, the music flowed in a pleasing rhythm, and my soul was happy. I was myself. Without any attention to my actions, thoughts, or emotions, I experienced utter satisfaction. And best of all, the feeling was occurring with increased frequency. At this point, I started writing the journals that became my first book, The Ebb and Flow of Living. In it, I wrote to Françoise and described our meeting, the joy that made me feel like my soul was streaming light in the dark vastness of outer space, and our journey together to Chile's Central Valley. When Françoise first invited me to spend the summer with her in the valley, I was sitting at home in the late afternoon. Not long after I hung up the phone, Isabella returned home from her job at one of the banks in downtown Santiago. I could no longer deceive her. Yet I didn't want to hurt her feelings or her sense of self-esteem. I wanted to break the news of my affair as gently as possible. Isabella, I don't think our relationship is working out, I said. Without breaking her stride as she hung up her coat and dropped off some groceries on the kitchen counter, she replied, We've been over this before. We just need to give it time. I'm waiting for my promotion at the bank, and you've got to finish your internship. Then we can think about moving to a bigger apartment and buying a nicer car. No, I don't want to continue our relationship. Someone invited me to a hacienda in the valley for the summer, and I've decided to go. She stopped moving about the apartment but remained standing. Is there another woman? Is that what you're telling me? Yes, and you know I've wanted to end our relationship for a long time and haven't felt strong enough to do it until now. I'm sorry. I don't mean to hurt you. She crossed to where I was sitting and sat on the edge of a nearby chair. Well, I intend to keep the apartment. You may keep the apartment, I said. And you're not going to take all of our furniture. I'll not live in a barren house. You may keep the furniture, I said. And I expect to keep the car. I need it when I go to visit my mother in Concepcion. You may keep the car. This meaningless exchange, a recitation of the laundry list of our collected material possessions, made me realize how dead I had become inside. I was so mired in my day-to-day existence that I actually became an observer rather than a participant in my own life. Looking at it from a new perspective was shocking indeed. This relationship had no real intimacy, no sense of openness or unity. It was much more than a lack of communication that ended it. It was a lack of communion with another human being. I had sacrificed my values for convenience. Unconsciously, perhaps, I had used Isabella's companionship to help me get through the rigors of medical school. We were never right for each other. Long after I realized our relationship was wrong, I stayed in it. I didn't have the courage or the energy to risk finding real love. The coincidental meeting with Françoise shook me from my coma and made me realize that there could be a soulmate for each of us, a kindred spirit one is linked with throughout eternity. I was not sure if Françoise was mine, but she made me aware of that possibility. Françoise and I left the city in her blue Fiat the morning after my breakup with Isabella. Françoise's friends lived in the valley's farmlands. But the burden of laying to rest my relationship with Isabella lifted, I felt an even greater sense of freedom. As Françoise and I drove down from the capital city, the air cleared both physically and spiritually. we left the past behind. I saw every new stretch of road and every town we passed through as magical and exciting. We traveled the Pan-American Highway with the snow-clad Andes looming on the right and the lower coastal range on the left. We drove between the mountains into a valley of rich farmland with melons, wheat, corn, and especially grapevines growing everywhere. The valley was cooled in the summers by Pacific breezes, so it practically gushed with flowers and fruit trees. We sometimes felt as if we were traveling through a Van Gogh painting. Farmers wearing blue jackets and straw hats worked the soil, planting, hoeing, and plowing behind teams of oxen. In the towns, fruit and vegetable stands vied for space with horses pulling carts, and shoppers with their dogs, chickens, and cows. A city boy my whole life, the scenery captivated me. My mind and heart opened to each new feeling and experience. I stopped analyzing my feelings and thoughts and instead allowed life to flow through me. I felt one with both heaven and earth. I stopped trying to solve the puzzle of the heart and instead worked to frame the exquisiteness of God's masterpiece through poetry and writing. I wrote the ebb and flow of living in rich prose. Deep in the Central Valley, we turned east onto an unpaved road. Only after we turned did I notice a small sign pointing the way. Dairy cows grazing in pastures looked up, startled at the sound of our car's motor. As we climbed a small grassy hill, the hacienda came into view. The property, 1,000 acres of farmland and another 8,000 acres of Andean foothills, had remained intact for hundreds of years. Colonial buildings made of white adobe, with wide verandas and ceramic tile roofs, were settled between bright-colored gardens. This place was the setting for the awakening of a love that seemed to transcend time and place. As we pulled up to the main building, 2 peacocks strutted by screaming. We laughed at our unique welcoming committee. Over the next 2 months, the two of us traveled from the farmland to the ocean and back. When we looked into the eyes of the peasants we met, we felt like we were glimpsing scenes of paradise. The spiritual wealth they held, uncomplicated lifestyles, their sense of connection with God, the land, and each other defied their lack of material possessions. It seemed the soul of the countryside evoked the soul in each of us. I was transformed and realized the love I felt was not just directed at Françoise. I was in a state of love with the universe. This natural environment and the simple lives of the people and animals there conveyed a sense of timelessness. The cycles of nature, birth, aging, death, and new birth were more apparent in such a setting. Being in nature was yet another way to enter the timeless state in which I could connect with the soul and perceive the sacred. I realized the essential soul in each of us manifests itself in time through our interests, our qualities, and our feelings. The lessons we learn at each step build upon what we already know as we grow and gain wisdom. The essential self that is one with every other living thing is unchanging. Throughout our lives, however, our realization of it does change. I was fortunate and determined enough to embark on a quest for the sacred in life, and consequently, my soul awareness grew stronger. Many times Françoise described the joy she was feeling as a sense of freedom. She would often run ahead of me and then wait for me to catch up. One day as we walked along the crest of a hill, carrying our picnic lunch of champagne, fruit, and chocolate rum balls, she suddenly took off down the hillside through the tall grass. When I finally caught up with her minutes later, she was sitting cross-legged beneath a small tree by a stream. We were both breathless. I finally caught my breath and asked her if this was where she wanted to eat our lunch, but she ignored my question. "I don't care if I die homeless, poor, and alone," she announced. "I would feel my life was wasted if I spent years in the same place. I could never buy land and feel tied to it. To me, freedom is much more important." She leaped up and started climbing the small tree. Everything relates to freedom, she called to me, because it's a natural central state. It has no form. It's the place where all things and events exist. I set down our picnic lunch. I think I wouldn't mind getting a home somewhere. I would like to be able to afford a place with a nice view and antique furniture and... You need to reorient your mind, she interrupted. You're too focused on things. Things tie you down, box you in, and you need to stop thinking. Try to just be here in the now. The word now triggered a memory from my childhood. I had developed a sort of meditation one afternoon. I was on my bed, which was covered with a yellow blanket, doing my homework, when I looked up at the little Baroque-style clock on my desk to see how long it would be before dinner. It was 3 o'clock. So I said to myself, now it is 3 o'clock. I kept repeating the word now over and over as I watched the hands of the clock slowly moving. By focusing so intently on the movement of the clock's hands, the sense of time passing actually disappeared, and it felt like I was experiencing one expanded, constant moment. My body seemed to grow and shrink with each breath, as if I was losing myself and then regaining it with each inhalation. More than an hour passed according to the clock, but I sensed it as one long moment, a single now. Everything seemed clearer and less tense. When now is a mere instant in the long march of history and the future, it is much more difficult to perceive our soul and its connection to other living things. Time goes by too fast. When now is long enough to shut out the distracting pull of flowing time, wisdom comes, and the sacred is revealed. I once again entered that state. Jetzt, aber jetzt, aber jetzt, aber jetzt. Françoise climbed down out of the tree and came over, putting her hand on my shoulder. I stopped my meditation and looked up at her. What were you doing? She asked. What is that word, jetzt? I pulled her down to sit beside me and put my arm around her waist. It's German for now. I need to concentrate on this moment. I want to make it last forever. We kissed, and then she asked how this meditation worked. As you concentrate on and relax into the present moment, I explained, you enter a state of timelessness. Repeating the word now over and over helps keep your consciousness from sliding into the problems of a past that's over or a future yet to be. When the inner silence becomes complete, even for an instant, all your daily thoughts and experiences become anecdotal. They seem like fairy tales you heard as a young child, losing much of their power to evoke fear or anger or frustration in you. They seem distant and insignificant compared to the essential essence you are connecting with. I saw Françoise watching me as I spoke, listening intently. This encouraged me to share more. I call this the I am at our core that has no label. In this sacred state of consciousness, thoughts and feelings are there, but they seem to gently float past our awareness. We become a sort of unbiased observer, a witness to what is going on. It's like bare attention. Bare attention, she raised an eyebrow in curiosity. Bare attention is concerned only with the present. It teaches us what so many have forgotten. To live with full awareness in the now. To face the present without trying to escape into thoughts about the past or the future. Past and future are not objects of observation, but of reflection. For some, the past and the future become ideas of religious or wise reflection, but for most, they become objects of daydreaming and vain imaginings, which are the main enemies of clear understanding or a clear mind. Bare attention, Françoise mused. I think I felt that way. Often when I first wake up in the morning, or sometimes just before I fall asleep at night, there's a sort of dreamy quality to my perception, though I'm conscious. I feel like everything that I planned to do and everything that happened during the preceding day were far, far away. And when I get out of bed, I could find myself in an entirely different life. There in the valley with my lover, I experienced the best of times. I sometimes thought about responsibilities and undone tasks awaiting me back at the hospital, but I believed I had to enjoy this opportunity while it was there. Too many times I postponed a chance for joy and happiness and found much of its richness and energy dissipated over the time I did something more important. Entering the hacienda felt like entering the gates of heaven. Francoise's friends furnished the building with brass beds, wood-burning cast-iron stoves, armoires, oriental carpets, and hand-carved furniture. The beautiful surroundings added texture to our intense passion. Making love there opened to me an awareness of the soul that I never wanted to lose again. I didn't ever want to go back to the dependency on rationality and pragmatism that had characterized my life in Santiago. I tried to convince myself that what I was now feeling had as much or more potential for bringing me success in life. I wrote in my journal, "This relationship has opened a perspective about a change I envision going on at this time for everybody on the planet. It is as if the feeling of being in love makes one believe that everyone is in love. But here is also a vision that a spiritual value change is happening in the world, or needs to happen at this time, recovery of soul and sacredness and spiritual values. The misery of the world is not being solved through society's old modes of change. There needs to be a new availability of solutions. It is like a collective coming of a Messiah or messianic consciousness that is not singularized to any particular individual. It is a new commitment, a new consciousness entering the world that will interconnect individuals through happenings like this encounter with Francoise. She is my wake-up call, awakening a deeper memory in myself and awakening me to a positive psychology very distinct from what I have been living in current everyday reality. I hope this chapter of my life never closes." The manuscript describing my experiences with Francoise made its way to the Chilean presidential candidate, mystic and Nobel Prize-winning poet, Pablo Neruda, via a friend of mine. I didn't even realize Neruda had received the manuscript until I answered the phone one day. Neruda personally called to say he had read the manuscript and it deserved to be published. I almost fainted. When I composed myself enough to respond, he added that he would be happy to write a preface for it and find me a publisher. I shared my surprise and joy with all my friends. The book was published only a few months later to widespread rave reviews. By this time, Francoise was gone. Her vacation had ended and she returned to Europe to resolve her problems there. I missed her terribly, but I would always remember what this wild, free woman had taught me. It took me a long time to be able to love again as I had loved her, but she gave me a valuable gift, the ability to open up my heart to all circumstances. This showed me that I was capable of a deep capacity for loving. The relationship returned me to my path by showing me how to incorporate the meaning of life's events into my essence instead of futilely trying to master the events technically. I opened myself to the urges of my spirit and surrendered the idea of manipulating the world to satisfy my perceived needs. Only after my return did I realize it was quite a challenge to keep this insight while working in the socialized model of medicine and dealing with forms, supplies, and politics. A year later, I was finishing up my internship at a hospital in Santiago. I lived in a high-rise apartment building near the hospital. This proximity to the hospital was a great benefit, since I often returned from one of the 48-hour shifts that characterized most of my internship with barely enough energy to cook myself a meal and collapse. Being awake for those long periods was not the main factor in my fatigue, however. Chile was experiencing the chaos of political instability and 300% inflation. Consequently, doctors often worked without the most basic supplies, like IV tubing, bandages, and iodine. These conditions also contributed to extreme overwork. Interns assigned to rural clinics were often given caseloads of 62 patients to see in a single morning. One of my first cases on such a day was a man who gestured wildly and spoke in broken sentences. When he told me there had been blood during coughing, I asked him to cough for me. He replied, "It's not me, it's my wife." "Well, where is she?" I asked incredulously. "She's waiting in the hall," he replied. "Do you want to see her?" I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm as I calculated how much time I would have for 60 other patients. "Yes, bring her in," I said at last. The woman was very large and literally bundled from head to toe in 4 layers of clothing. She looked like a stack of laundry with eyes and a nose peeking out. I got out my stethoscope and asked her to undress so I could listen to her lungs. We had been taught to examine patients with their clothes off, but this woman was taking so long to unbutton and untie all her garments that I just thrust the stethoscope down the neck of her sweaters and listened to her lungs in that awkward position in order to save time. I could tell she had a fever and her breathing was little more than a wheeze, so I immediately suspected pneumonia. I look back on that now and can't imagine practicing medicine with such time constraints. 1 week before my internship ended, amidst the accompanying stress and insanity, I received a phone call at my apartment. "I would like an appointment to speak with you," the woman said. "I'm not taking private patients. You will have to contact the hospital where I work." I started giving her the hospital administration's department number. The woman's voice grew stern. "I am not calling for an examination." "I really don't have time to see you," I said arrogantly. "I leave Chile in a week to start a residency in Boston." "I must speak to you before you leave," the woman insisted. Despite further tries to put her off or at least find out what she wanted, she told me she would call again and hung up. The following Monday morning, before I even got out of bed, the same woman called to say she was in the neighborhood and would drop by in a half hour. I had no idea how she got my address, and I considered not letting her in when she arrived. I decided to be cordial and got up to shower and dress. Exactly 30 minutes later, I heard a knock at my door, and a Middle Eastern woman entered my apartment carrying a copy of my book, The Ebb and Flow of Living. She was a short woman but firmly built, and she exuded a tangible strength. Her long black hair was coiled on top of her head, and looking at her profile, she seemed to be of Greek descent. Middle-aged and elegantly dressed, she sat down, and I noticed her dark, piercing eyes and thought she must be a very powerful person. "I hope you don't mind my packing while we talk," I said as I put some books in one of the open packing crates in my table. She pointed at the boxes. "That is not important. What are you planning to do with your life?" When I started talking about my upcoming residency in pediatrics and my hopes of becoming a professor of medicine, she interrupted me. "No, what do you want to do with your life?" I shrugged and shook my head. I'm sure my disorientation was evident to her. "Do you know who Gurdjieff is?" she asked very deliberately. "No, I have no idea who you're talking about." "And you don't know Ouspensky either." I was quickly becoming confused by this strange woman. "They both sound Russian," I ventured as my mind, grasping for straws, turned to the upcoming election the Marxists were predicted to win. Was this woman looking for future candidates? And if so, What did this have to do with my book? Do you comprehend the depth of what you have written? She said as she gestured with the book. You have forgotten again, she went on. Gurdjieff was a Russian mystic from Georgia, a man who left his homeland and founded the Institute for Harmonious Living of Man. Ouspensky was a mathematician and something of a mystic himself. When Gurdjieff read Ouspensky's book, In Search of the Miraculous, he sought out the author and posed that question. Do you comprehend the depth of what you have written? When Ouspensky seemed confused by the question, Gurdjieff replied, If you would have known what you wrote about, I would have sat at your feet and followed you as my master. But you don't know what you have written. At that, Gurdjieff left. I must say the same to you. I hope you wake up again. She stood up and left without saying farewell, slamming the door behind her. Astonished, I sat there staring at the door for several minutes. What did this mean? Gradually, I shook off my amazement and continued packing my things for my move to Boston. My residency in pediatrics at the Children's Hospital of Harvard was characterized by constant work with very little free time. I worked part of the time in the city of Boston and part in a small hospital outside the city. Again, I was back in the cycle of long shifts, but now even the time between was often filled with hours of library research. At least in Chile, I had parties and dinners to go to when the shifts were over. Here I felt great loneliness. The people at the hospital seemed a bit cold, though there was little time to spend socializing with the few friends I had. When I did leave the hospital, the winter weather was cold and foggy. I felt like I was being tested. I was enduring this rat race in order to embark on an academic career that might eventually give me access to a full professorship at a top university, I told myself. An important lesson I received at that time, one that would shape my future destiny, ironically took place at the home of one of my professors. I was invited there one evening for dinner. My host was a renowned pediatrician whose publications were influential throughout the world. I had read his books while in Chile. His discoveries and papers seemed to be transforming the field. I had expected to dine with the rest of his family, but when I arrived, there were only 2 places set at the rather large dining table. In South America, dinners are a nightly event for socializing, conducting business, and meeting new people, so I felt this dinner for 2 would likely make for a lonely evening. My professor had prepared the meal himself, and it was simple and straightforward. We started with a salad and crabs, then had fish as the entree, and finished with coffee and dessert. After bringing our dinner out of the kitchen and serving the 2 of us, he opened a bottle of scotch and sat down to share the miseries of his life. As we drank together, he told me his wife was dating another man. Being a Bostonian gentleman, the good doctor agreed to remain living with her, though they slept in separate bedrooms. His daughter was a drug addict, living in the streets of San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district. His son had fled to Canada to avoid the military draft during the Vietnam War. The family had no structure, no center. I stayed overnight in his mansion. He accompanied me upstairs and told me, "You can stay in this room if you want." The room was a beautiful suite with an enormous private bathroom and all kinds of luxurious details. Even though I was very tired, I couldn't sleep. I gazed out the bedroom window of this beautiful mansion on a snowy beach, just an hour north of Boston. I stayed up for several hours and thought about the famous man living in the large, silent house. Was this the life I was preparing for myself? I reviewed my plans. If I go on with this career, I told myself, I run the risk of high-tech medicine affecting my soul. I fantasized about how I would become less and less human each passing day. The pressure of competition would force me to specialize and devote myself to my career more and more deeply every day to survive in this environment. After finishing my residency, I would become an instructor. In 3 years, I might become an assistant professor. In 3 more years, if at all, I might become an associate professor. If everything turned out right, I would have to sacrifice everything outside of my career specialization, but I would be deserving of full professorship and the same honors my host had achieved. But I would be deeply conditioned and foreign to everything except my technical specialty. I defined foreign as the state of consciousness in which one has completely forgotten oneself as a human being. It would not be a matter of lacking time for music, reading, or sports, but something more like forgetting my breathing or forgetting my essence. I felt I would not have a moment for the remembrance of the sacred self. I wondered if I really wanted that for myself. I could see that this life could be empty, lacking spirituality, humanity, and variety. It could also lack happiness, enthusiasm, and thankfulness due to its pressures. I thought about why I was in Boston. I came here to learn about human development through the study of pediatrics. I wanted to achieve greater insight into the transitional period of adolescence and why so few Westerners complete that transition gracefully, if at all. I believed adolescence, which should be a fairly normal rite of passage, contained a great key to healing. From my studies of anthropology, I knew that people who experienced adolescent initiations into adulthood led lives that were more balanced spiritually and materially. I also knew that these initiation rituals took place mainly in cultures defined as primitive. These cultures had rites and rituals that combined the hormonal and biological changes the adolescent was going through with the societal changes the child must endure in order to become an adult. These adolescents experienced the death of the child within themselves in order to precipitate the birth of the adult. The West was definitely missing a key in the adolescent spiritual quest. The results could be seen in the high rates of teen delinquency that were already prevalent at this time. I didn't find that key, but I did learn that an academic life too easily led to isolation and left little room for spirit. Perhaps psychiatry would be more open to the sacred, I thought as I finally turned off the ornate brass bedside lamp. I had heard of an opening for a resident in psychiatry at a hospital in Chile during a recent vacation there. As I tried to fall asleep for the few hours remaining until morning, I resolved to apply for it. I was accepted into the program in Chile a few months later and bid farewell to the cold intensity of my life as a pediatrician in Boston. I excitedly looked forward to the next step of my search for spirit and healing. I had only been back in Chile a matter of days when I invited a beautiful young medical student named Yasmin out on a date. I felt a strange attraction to this rather tall, olive-skinned woman in her early 20s. She reminded me vaguely of someone, and I was drawn to her. Upon arriving at her house to pick her up for dinner, I was introduced to her mother. My jaw dropped. She was the mysterious woman who had stormed out of my apartment a year ago. Seeing mother and daughter together, I definitely saw the resemblance. A smile started to form on her face as she recognized me. So, does our second meeting mean you have awakened again? I smiled back. I have come to believe that anyone who defies all probabilities and comes into my life twice must have something to teach me. I sat down and started talking with a woman whose name was Lila, and who turned out to be an esoteric teacher of Sufism, an Oriental mystical tradition that shares an inner core with many Western religious traditions, including Christianity and Islam. She told me that Sufi teachings were at the heart of the mystical tradition that flourished during the medieval times, and many saints from this time, including St. Francis of Assisi, reflected Sufi ideals. As part of the purification process before battle, Christian knights of the chivalric order would repeat a prayer while lying prostrate before an altar. That prayer, "Forgive my errors, O you the most powerful," is essentially a Sufi prayer. She shared various Sufi texts and teachings with me for hours that evening. These texts stress the understanding of an evolutionary potential for soul development, given as the message of the mystics, and showed how an underlying design was operating in our lives. One of the texts pointed to the balance of vocation and career, teaching in ancient forms that one should learn a livelihood to support oneself and spend the rest of the time cultivating awareness. It added that the Western world's preoccupation with material survival was harmful to awakening. It kept most of our attention stuck in the concept, all that matters is solid. Once we began talking, I knew my date with Yasmin would not take place. "I read your book," Lila explained, "and I was struck by how perfectly you wrote about a state of being I have struggled my whole life to attain." She stood up. "Would you like something to drink?" "Water, please," I replied. "What state of being were you referring to?" She returned from the kitchen with a pitcher and a glass. There is a technique known to the Sufi masters as the traspasso of baraka, or transfer of blessings. In your book, you described looking into your lover's eyes. It was just like the master staring into another human's eyes to see the divinity in that person and the portal to the universal consciousness that lies beyond them. It's a tool for enlightenment, used to reach an ecstatic state of timelessness you described as soul awareness. Lila placed the pitcher and the glass on a nearby table, filled my glass, and resumed her seat across from me. Like the air that sustains us, we cannot see the soul. Like the air, we only become aware of our soul when it moves like the wind or when we feel we are suffering for lack of it. We're all born with a soul. It's the internal power that animates the body and brings consciousness to your worldly experiences. Every soul is perfect, and it contains the experience of many levels of life and of consciousness. But in order to experience that perfection, we have to be awakened or activated so that we shift from a superficial identity to the essential one. Isn't that what you were trying to describe in the ebb and flow of living? As I took a drink of water, she leaned forward and pointed her finger at me. "You are a doctor. What then is the difference between a living body and a corpse?" I started to list the signs of life for her. A dead person's lungs and heart stop operating. The brain discontinues its electric nerve impulses. The body temperature drops to that of the room. "No," she interrupted. "What causes all these bodily processes to shut down?" "There are many causes for death," I said. "The lungs may become congested and stop supplying oxygen to the body. The heart may become injured or obstructed, and the blood circulation may be cut off." "Tell me," she interrupted again, "don't our bodies fight off congestion, injuries, and obstruction for years and years? When people die, they have decided that earthly life is no longer where they want to be. Their souls leave their bodies, and then the body shuts down." I thought back to when I was 9 years old. My grandpa was getting older, and with age came the distress of disease and concern from his family and friends. Grandpa was a very pious and religious man, but the enjoyment I had seen on his face during prayer was rapidly declining. On a Sunday night, when it seemed that all was coming to an end, Grandpa gathered the family together and blessed each of us. Later in the evening, around 8 o'clock, he spoke to his wife of 60 years in a gentle, loving tone. "Do not cry," he told my grandmother. "The Lord is calling, and I must go. I will not leave you here for long." He closed his eyes and left this world moments later. I had already gone home by that time because my parents felt it would be too traumatic for a child to be around such a normal event as death. I sat in my bedroom and made a pledge with God to spare my beloved grandpa. I felt I needed to sacrifice something for God to intervene and save him, but I had no idea what I could offer. I finally prayed, "Oh God, if I sacrifice and chew this piece of gum all night, please spare my grandpa's life." But God did not enter my deal. I was deeply frustrated until 2 nights later. I dreamt I was in the presence of my grandfather. Smiling, he approached me and told me of eternity. "Don't worry about anything," he told me. "Life goes on, and I love you the same as before. All you must remember is the need for fundamental unity before what people call death." Grandfather advised me to pray the Shema, which was his spiritual practice. The Shema is an anchor or pivot prayer on which an individual meditates. My grandfather prayed, "Hear, O Israel, the eternal is the Lord. The eternal is one." He also reminded me to constantly do teshuvah, the prayer of repentance or return to the source. Real transformation, he said, means unity, the reconnection of the soul. And this shift can happen at any moment. He taught me a prayer of radical forgiveness. It went like this: "I hereby forgive all. May no one be punished on my account. I hereby forgive all. May no one be punished on my account." I was thinking of this as Lila refilled my water glass from the pitcher, while listing books I should read that should show me paths to awareness of my soul. I was intrigued with what she described as reconnecting with the soul, since it promised to bring back the joy I had felt and described in my book. I asked her to teach me one of her techniques for reaching that connected state. She told me to put down my glass, lean back in the chair, close my eyes, and relax. The masters teach that there are 2 streams of energy that anchor soul awareness in the body. They are subtler than the physical and even more subtle than the mental. One stream goes into the heart, and the other goes into the head. The stream going into the heart brings life force. The stream to the head enters near the pineal gland and the forehead and connects our consciousness with cosmic intelligence, the mind that connects all living things. Many cultures call this the third eye. You will feel it as a subtle vibration. This is eternal force uniting you with all life. Move your consciousness away from this room and the sensations of your body, her voice soothed. Orient your awareness towards subtler and more intimate phenomena. Raise your attentions to the head. Go inward into the area of the pineal gland, in the center of your brain. This is still a physical focus, but of a more inward nature. Concentrate and hold your attention at this spot in the center of the head. Next, go in even further. Don't make it difficult. Just transcend the physical plane and imagine and visualize yourself moving into a subtler level of being. Move into the mental plane. Here you may experience a first indication that you are advancing toward the soul. As you move inward to each subtler, more abstract level, you will sense a shift. The consciousness aspect of the soul is on the more abstract levels of the mental plane. Stay in here with your inward gaze focused at this point. Your attention is focused inward on the mental plane. Now move to the abstract levels of the mental plane. In other words, keep moving to the subtler levels of being. The soul is a light body situated in the causal body. Try to consciously sense the soul's light, the higher vibration. This higher vibration flooding your body is like nothing you have ever experienced and is the first clue you will have of the soul. You will remember this experience. Stay focused on this subtler level as long as you can. A sure way to know if you have contacted the soul, even if not visually, is the reciprocal energy or potency you receive from touching it. You will definitely be stimulated. Your physical body will feel an increased potency. Imagine your center of being in your heart. Imagine the observer in you, centered in your forehead. Now visualize a vortex of energy in your heart and your forehead. These energy vortexes feel like electric fire. I can see these vortexes, I told her, but I do not feel any energy flowing. You must learn to surrender. You must give up your attachments to this world to perceive the world of the soul. What do you mean by attachments? I asked. Ah, Lila sighed. You fear you must give up all the things you have known to reconnect with the soul. She paused. No, you do not need to become a hermit. Once you reconnect with the higher part of yourself, you will still have a body. You'll still exist in the world of emotions and sensations and physical manifestations. Your responsibilities to this world do not end when you enter the spirit realm. Perhaps you should think of attachments as expectations of how the world exists and functions. It may feel like a death, but you will discover that you never really died. My mind turned to a class in medical school on embryology and obstetrics. The lecturer had pointed to a diagram of a fetus on the wall and said, "The child will not enter the birth canal until it has surrendered. It will struggle to stay in the aquatic world it has known, but eventually it will need to give up on that world before it can enter our world." I inhaled deeply, returning to the present. A new sensation came over me, and I told Lila that I could now sense the burning energy in my heart and my forehead. Now imagine these two vortexes are shaped like lotus flowers. Each has 9 orange outer petals and 3 yellow inner petals, folded around a center that emanates love. This is not sympathetic love, though. This is not an earthly love. When you feel the divine energy emanating from the centers of these 2 lotuses, you have entered a universe with very different laws from those of this physical world. I thought back to the love I felt toward everything and everyone that summer with Francoise. This love was another way to recognize the state of soul awareness. I thought to myself, it feels timeless, and it feels like one is in love with the universe. I sat and took in the feeling of lightness and serenity that washed over me. I felt calmer and more energized at the same time. I don't know how long I sat there in silence, but when I finally opened my eyes, Lila was gone. I started to panic and feel suspicious. The feelings of lightness and serenity faded rapidly. I got up to find her. I called out, "Hello," and she appeared from a doorway behind me. "It is late," she said. "You must go." The sensation I felt was amazing, I told her. "But I have lost it." Lila showed me to the door and said, "You'll be able to maintain that state of being only when you do the inner work necessary to stop seeing the personality that you identify as yourself as something separate and different from the soul you reconnected with a few minutes ago. This will give you a new view of life, one in which you will be in charge of the energy. This energy will respond to the way you think about yourself, life, and the universe. In other words, through meditation, you will see that the basic component of the universe is pure energy, and that this energy is changeable with your human intention. Your intention causes energy to flow and affect other systems. This is what the ancient mystics knew, and the quantum physicists are discovering.